Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and long-term investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Hello and welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, episode 115. I'm Jesse Kramer. By day, I work at a fiduciary wealth management firm helping clients nationwide. You can learn more at bestinterest.blog/work. Link is in the show notes. And by night, I write the Best Interest blog and I host this podcast. I put out a weekly newsletter, all of which help busy professionals and retirees avoid mistakes, grow their wealth by simplifying their investing, their taxes, and their retirement planning. And today is going to be a fun, somewhat cathartic episode of me pointing out some of the common problems, the common hiccups, some common frustrations that I observe with other financial professionals, with DIY investors, DIY planners, other content creators. And I'm not recording this episode for my own therapeutic purposes, although that'll be a nice side effect. Instead, my hope is that by highlighting some of these negatives, you all will be able to pull a Charlie Munger, as it were, and invert, always invert. And if you choose to avoid the negatives, if you invert on those negatives, you will, by definition, be more positive. So anyway, that's the goal. But first, let's do a review of the week. This one is from Scott Anderson.
Mr. Anderson.
Clear, engaging, educational, 5 stars. I came across this podcast at the recommendation from Talking Real Money, and I am so glad I checked it out. The clear and practical approach from an engineering type perspective really resonates with me. The ability to chart out your own success and plan in Excel is something that really excites me, and it's something I've taken steps to do. I really feel more empowered to my own retirement instead of more of a spray and pray method that I've seen with friends and colleagues. Thanks for putting on such a great show. Well, Scott Anderson, thank you so much for the kind words and the 5-star review. Feel free to shoot me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog, and I'll get you hooked up with a super soft t-shirt. Okay, let's go through some fun, some interesting, some often negative, common tropes, common mistakes, common hiccups that I see in this world of financial planning. Just stuff that I will maybe run into time after time via Reddit posts or time after time on the DIY Facebook groups, or just emails, repeated emails that I'll get from listeners that are just earnest and honest emails that I totally understand where they're coming from, but yet are full of mistakes that I hope we all can avoid. So this first one is kind of the screw taxes and screw them in one fell swoop approach. Now, what do I mean by that? A lot of people, we approach the world in a kind of rip off the bandaid type approach. And I put myself in this category. You know, is there a hard conversation that I need to have? Just have the conversation. Am I dreading a workout? Well, screw it. I'm going to lace up the shoes and I'm just going to get to work, and it's going to stink, at least for the first few minutes, but eventually I'll get used to it. Just dive in. But that same approach does not always apply to smart retirement planning, to smart financial planning. And here's the perfect example. A listener of the podcast, Roger, he wrote to me. He and his wife are in their early 70s. They have pensions. They have Social Security, summing up to about $150,000 a year of fixed income. They also have $4 million of pre-tax assets. So that's like pre-tax IRA, pre-tax 401k assets. And over the next few years, as they age into their RMD years, they'll eventually have $200,000 of RMDs kicking in. It'll only go higher in the future, bringing their baseline income to that 150 that was pension and Social Security plus 200 of RMDs. They'll have a baseline income of $350,000. Roger's worried about the taxes that come with those RMDs. He's worried about IRMA, all that kind of good retirement stuff that we've talked about here before. And Roger's instinct is to bite the bullet and convert all $4 million of his tax-deferred accounts to Roth accounts. And to do that mass conversion here in 2025, he'll pay about $1.4 million in taxes if he does that. And he'll use a combination of his taxable savings, of his Roth dollars, and of his taxable brokerage account, which will realize capital gains. And that will generate its own tax of about $250,000 more dollars. So he's going to use bank savings, taxable brokerage account, and Roth dollars to pay the approximately $1.65 million tax bill that he'll incur here in 2025. But then, going forward, Roger's going to be 100% Roth. He'll have no more RMDs. He'll eventually, because there's a 2-year delay with IRMA, if you're not aware, eventually he'll have no more IRMA. He'll really have no more extra taxes once we're a couple years down the line from this decision. And this is not the first time I've been asked about this exact strategy. Just taxes in retirement are intimidating. Taxes in retirement are scary. So I'm just going to rip the Band-Aid off, pay every cent of tax that I'll ever have to pay, convert everything I have into Roth dollars, and then I'll never worry about taxes again. But the short response to Roger's idea is that I highly, highly recommend you do not pursue this kind of path. At least, especially for Roger because of his specific case, but just in general, as a general rule of thumb, doing this is almost never the right path. Now, in Roger's case, he's going to be realizing $3.3 million. Of the $4 million that he and his wife convert, they're going to be realizing $3.3 million of those dollars at the 37% federal tax bracket, when simply they don't need to do that. As Roger pointed out in his question, right now, based on his income, his pension and Social Security income, he and his wife are actually in the 22% tax bracket. Once RMDs kick in, they will definitely move up into the 24% tax bracket. And then for IRMA, if IRMA affects you, the rule of thumb that I keep in mind as just this kind of this way to like gate how big IRMA is almost always going to be less than 1% of your annual income. Meaning, okay, if you earn in retirement like Roger and his wife eventually will, they'll be earning $350,000 of income between the pension, Social Security, and RMDs. The IRMA tax is going to be less than 1% of that, is going to be less than $3,500 per year. So Roger's plan, as he's kind of outlining it to me, is that he's going to trade his 22 or 24% tax rates right now, plus 1% for IRMA, that's right, maybe 23 or 25% federal taxes, the marginal, right? That's the marginal tax rate, in exchange for 37% marginal tax rates. I simply do not like that math whatsoever. Part of Roger's plan is also to use the $400,000 he currently has in Roth accounts to cover his tax bill. And that's almost never something we want to do, right? Roth dollars, once a dollar has kind of entered our Roth account, it's essentially one of the most precious dollars in our financial ecosystem, in our financial plan, because you never have to pay taxes on it again. So to withdraw all those Roth dollars all at once to cover an unnecessary tax bill is something we never want to do. And part of his question that maybe I should have highlighted earlier is he said part of his plan as he's outlining it is because he's specifically wants to take advantage of some of the things highlighted in the Big Beautiful Bill that was recently passed by Congress. And one of my thoughts there is that the benefits of the Big Beautiful Bill are going to help out Roger and his wife with or without this drastic tax plan that he suggested. I see lots of problems with that plan. So again, going back to the idea where a lot of times as investors, as planners, as retirees, part of our human instinct, maybe just part of the way we approach the world, is to just rip off the Band-Aid, to do the hard things and to do them all at once. And in a lot of places in life and a lot of facets in life, I totally get that and I agree with that too. But I think that financial planning is one where we don't always want to rip off the Band-Aid all at once. We don't always want to do all our Roth conversions at once. We don't always want to deposit a lump sum into the market all at once. There are perfectly rational and mathematical reasons for sometimes delaying things over time, for planning years ahead and then executing that plan. And this is one perfect example of that. The next one, I want to talk about the availability bias and how it affects investors and how it affects retirees of all stripes. So this availability bias, also known as the availability heuristic, it's one of those cognitive biases, right? Behavioral finance, Danny Kahneman, Richard Thaler, Nobel winners who have won these Nobel Prizes in economics for their work in the way that human psychology makes us do irrational things. So the availability bias describes the tendency for people to rely on the information that comes to mind most readily when making judgments or decisions. So instead of taking their time and thinking through all the possible information, not only the information that they know, but instead of realizing like, oh, there are probably some things that I'm not thinking of here, and I should take those things into account too. I should research those things and try to figure out what I don't know, taking that into account. The availability bias says we have a tendency to only rely on the information that comes to our mind when we're making judgments or decisions. Totally understandable, right? But of course, it leads to biased and flawed decision-making because, well, the most easily accessible information may not be the most representative or the most accurate of the complete truth. And specifically, vivid or recent experiences, dramatic experiences like dramatic news stories, and very personal experiences, those tend to be more readily available. And the ease of recall is often confused with the probability of or frequency of experiences repeating themselves in the future. And that leads to the belief that easily remembered events are also more common events or are also more likely events and more common and more likely to occur than reality actually plays out. And I see availability bias happening all the time in personal finance, and a few main examples that come to mind. here's one. My neighbor, my brother, my colleague is doing X, is doing this thing. And I think I should be doing X too. So maybe X is they're all in on the stock market. They're buying a rental house. They're planning to retire at age 50. They hired an accountant. They fired an accountant. Whatever it may be, the idea is that this person I know, or sometimes it gets even worse if it happens in multiple, these multiple people I know are all doing this one thing. And I think I should be doing this one thing too. Perhaps the most common one I hear, a person told me about X company. Do you think it's a good investment? I'm seeing a lot of X company in the news. X company is building a store in my city. X company started making Y product, and my son and his friends are all into Y product. Shouldn't I invest in X company? Those are all examples where we use the information that's right in front of our face, and we add this almost artificial importance to the information that's right in front of our face. And by definition, we're unaware of all the information that is not available to us, right? It's that classic saying of, I don't know what I don't know. We don't know what we don't know. But instead, we're letting our neighbor's behavior, our son's behavior, we're taking the fact that some person told us about X company, and now it's front of mind. It's super available to us. And somewhere in our irrational brains, we've convinced ourselves that we ought to be investing. We ought to be taking advantage. We ought to be copying what the other people are doing too. So a lot of times, I guess, when you see what someone else is doing in their life, or when you see someone's justification for doing X, Y, Z, when you feel that little impulse in your head that you ought to be doing X, Y, Z too, you might want to ask yourself, do you understand the entire situation? Or are you simply succumbing to the very understandable, the very human bias of availability bias? All right, this next one is a little bit of a pet complaint. Again, I think it's important for, especially if you're out there DIYing stuff, I think this is really important for you to understand. It is a little nuanced. I hope I can explain it clearly. And it starts with the simple fact that, yeah, numbers are hard. Math can be hard. But at the end of the day, I'm going to explain these two different things, the arithmetic mean, the arithmetic average, and the geometric average. And I know it sounds a little esoteric, but if you're using the arithmetic average, which I will explain what that means, and if you're using that to determine your average investing returns over time, it means one of two things. It either means that you have a very important and vital misunderstanding of the underlying math, and we'll explain why that is, or, and this is the one that kind of irks me more, sometimes I think it means that there's an intentional decision for someone to obfuscate the truth. There's an intentional decision for someone to use the incorrect math. Okay, so the reason why I say that is because sometimes I will see some really smart content creator or some smart financial professional, maybe it's another advisor, an asset manager, someone with a big title at a nationally known firm, and they'll make a comment like this. They'll say, if your return is 0% in year one, then 30% in year two, and then 0% in year three. So again, that was 0, 30, and 0. And then they'll say your average return is 10% per year. And now they'll compare it to a second situation and they'll say, but if your return was 10% year one, 10% year two, and 10% in year three, so again, 10, 10, 10, they'll say your average return is also 10% per year. So they've laid out this argument that these two investors have the exact same average return, right? 0, 30, 0 versus 10, 10, 10. Then they'll go on to say, and yet, in the second example, you end up with more money. And listeners, again, if you plug these numbers into a spreadsheet, you'll see that what they've said is kind of true. The 10, 10, 10 example return does end up with more money than the 0, 30, 0 example. So before defining the problem with this example, though, before defining the problem, and I will define the problem, I will define what arithmetic versus geometric averages mean. I'll explain to you which one was used in this example and why it was wrong. Because if you're a serious DIY investor, if you're a serious retirement planner, if you're an advisor, I know there are a bunch of advisors who listen to my podcast, you do this professionally, and you help people with real problems. If you actually care that your numbers represent reality, you should never, never, never use the arithmetic average like this. And you should always, always, always instead use the geometric average, otherwise known as the compound average return. The geometric average is the compound average return. The arithmetic average is the one that we're used to using in most of our lives, right? We add up all the numbers and then we divide by the total. You know, it's Jim has 10 apples and Bob has 20 apples. So I take 10 and then I add 20. I divide by 2. Therefore, they each have 15 apples on average. That is the arithmetic average. But for investing, the reason why investing is such an amazing and wonderful force in our lives is the year by year growth. It doesn't work by simple addition. It compounds, right? Compound average is the reason we're all investing in the first place. And it's multiplicative. It's not just addition, it's multiplication. So going back to our earlier numbers, it's not 0% plus 30% plus 0. It's not 10% plus 10% plus 10%. It's 0% growth times 30% growth times 0% again. It's 10% times 10% times 10%. And so maybe I'm preaching to the choir here. Maybe you all know this. I hope many of you do know this. But suffice to say, if you're trying to find the annual average return from those two data sets, where you're multiplying 3 annual growth rates together, you cannot simply then divide by 3 to find the average. So arithmetically, right, we take a sum, we do addition, and then we divide by the total. We divide by 3 in this case. Geometrically, we have to take the product, so we multiply the growth rates together, that's a product, and then we have to take the nth root of that product to find the average. In this case, because we have 3 growth rates over 3 years, to take the nth root would be to raise it to the 1/3 power to find the product of that average. So of course, what I just explained is more complicated than the simple arithmetic average that we're used to. And so sometimes, a lot of times, I see this mistake happening and I simply think that's totally okay. This person just isn't familiar with the underlying math of investing, but once it's explained to them, they'll get it and they'll start using the right math here, going forward. And if you find yourself listening to this and that applies to you, this is wonderful. You've now learned you've learned the mistake and you can start using the geometric or the compound average going forward. But other times, especially when it's another kind of expert content creator or a financial professional who's doing the explaining, I get a little bit suspicious. And I think to myself, like, do you actually not know the differences between these two averages? Which is okay, I guess. But most of the time, I think to myself, this person knows better than that. This person knows how compound average growth rates work. And therefore, I begin to assume some sort of suspicious motive. Like, why would this person be getting this wrong? And there are some okay explanations that I think I know right. First, the arithmetic average is simply easier to calculate. Okay, yeah, that's easy. Second, the arithmetic average usually looks better. Whenever any volatility is involved, the arithmetic average is always going to be higher than the geometric average. That's just a principle of math. It's just the way the numbers work. And the third reason, they make the understandable, but again, easily avoidable mistake that average equals typical. They think to themselves, well, if I have 0, 30, 0, then I should say, well, what's the typical year for that investor? Well, we'll just shrug our shoulders and say it's about 10. I don't like that. It's a little bit lazy to me, but again, it's understandable from a human point of view. But it does make me think of the apocryphal investing story that maybe you've heard of the man who drowned in a river that was on average 3 feet high. So again, when we say words like average and typical, it can hide a lot of truth about a situation. You can have a river that's 3 feet high on average, but at some part is 10 feet deep and you're going to drown in it. So anyway, average and typical are dangerous words to some extent. But the fourth reason, and the one that I really want to focus on, is that I think some people use this literally incorrect math to weave a story that puts volatility as some sort of boogeyman to avoid. They say, well, look at this data. These averages are the same. And yet the volatility of the 0, 30, 0 situation causes that investor to perform worse than the other investor. And my rebuttal to that is no, the averages aren't the same. If they were the same, if you had two investments that perform the same on average, that would be using the geometric average, then the investments would have an identical performance. And instead, this person is just using bad math to weave an incorrect story. That begs another question. Why are they making volatility out to be the boogeyman? And I know, volatility can be hard to stomach. It can be hard to live through. That's something we talk about here all the time. But I heard a great quote from financial planner Michael Kitces, who described certain sales tactics as, quote, digging a hole, throwing the prospective client or customer down in the hole, and then telling them that you're the only one with a rope. And when I see someone who ought to know better getting this kind of math wrong, I also usually see them digging a hole. The hole is called volatility is an enemy. And then they throw their audience down in that hole saying, volatility can ruin your retirement. But then they offer a rope to get out of that hole. Oh, but my portfolio, my investments, my strategies, my annuities, my insurance product can dampen your volatility and smooth out your ride. And at the end of the day, in the examples I've seen, it's almost always a bit of a false equivalency, because I think if we were really talking about real world investment returns, real numbers, real portfolios, we wouldn't see the numbers I shared with you before of 10, 10, 10 versus 0, 30, 0. Instead, it would be 5, 5, 5 versus 0, 30, 0. Because whenever you have a situation with almost no volatility, you almost have to, by definition, be giving up some sort of return, risk and return. I know that risk and volatility aren't necessarily the same thing, but there's a relationship there. And whenever you have an investment that has a guaranteed or a steady return, you're almost always giving up some sort of reward. And in that case, despite the much higher volatility of the 0, 30, 0 investment, it would easily beat the low volatility 5, 5, 5% investment. So anyway, arithmetic mean, try to avoid it in investing. Instead, focus on the geometric or the compound average returns, the geometric mean. You'll end up with a much more realistic view of your financial plan, much more realistic numbers, and ultimately you will make better decisions because you're actually using the correct math. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. You probably know that I love listener-inspired content, but this is my first listener-inspired advertisement. Frank asked me, in short, Jesse, is there a best time to start working with you as a client? And the short answer is yes. There are two ideal times. One is at the beginning of a new year for probably some pretty obvious reasons, but the second one is right about now, September and October. It's the perfect time for year-end tax planning to ensure you find the correct balance of Roth conversions, tax gain or tax loss harvesting, making charitable gifts, spreading out any portfolio changes over multiple tax years, or whatever other tax dials we can turn for you. Working backward from the December 31st tax deadline, the time to start those initial conversations is right now, August, September, maybe into early October. You want to give yourself and us enough runway to make sure we get this right for you. So if you're interested in starting a conversation with me and my colleagues, you can go to bestinterest.blog/work and fill out the form there. Again, that's on my blog on the Work with Jesse page. The address is bestinterest.blog/work and fill out the form. The next one I want to talk about is this super common question that I get, that I read about online. This is a question that I myself asked at one point in my financial journey. And even a question that when I changed careers, it still kind of nagged me in the back of my mind, and I wasn't sure if I had a good answer for it at that point. And the question was, why would I hire a financial planner when index funds exist? And so obviously I'm a little biased here, but this is a fun and really interesting question worth answering. And first, I think to myself, we all make decisions every single day to hire professionals, a mechanic, contractor, a trainer, personal trainer, an attorney, a doctor, a lawyer. I guess the same thing as an attorney, isn't it? But in each case, I would argue that part, if not a majority of the thought process there is something like, I don't want to screw this up. The professional knows more than me. They can be more efficient than me and save me time. They do this every single day. I might only dabble. This issue stresses me out and they can help reduce my stress. They can hold me accountable to make sure that I actually follow through on what I need to do. They have tools and resources that I don't have. Ultimately, in every single one of these scenarios, the value that you get from the interaction with the professional, it kind of has to, economically, far outweigh the cost. Otherwise, obviously, you wouldn't do it. And that's going to be one of the main arguments we talk about here is, does the value of working with any professional, including a financial professional, does it outweigh the cost that you pay them? If you've interacted with a financial advisor whose only value add is that they will tell you they'll throw your money into index funds, I totally understand the hesitation to engage with someone like that. Perhaps worse might be the advisor whose only value add is to throw your money into like the A shares of an active mutual fund, because we know mathematically that that's not likely to work out in your favor, let alone the advisor who works off of commissions from a whole life insurance or annuities. And I get it. I mean, the reasons you're here listening to me right now is because you probably recognize the terrible value from that type of sales pitch too. And you've decided, yeah, I'm going to do this myself. I'm going to learn all these financial planning tactics. Maybe you're going to learn from podcasts like mine, from blogs like mine, and you're going to apply that in your own financial plan. If I contrast those kind of, I almost want to say objectively bad value propositions, if I contrast that against at least some, maybe it's a minority, but some important fiduciary advisors out there, that's where the conversation starts to get intriguing. Now, personally, I do know some fee-only advisors who try to beat the market. A few of them do succeed, most do not. And therefore, I think it's dubious to suggest that the value add is to beat the market. But let me start with this. I think it's okay for an advisor to say, I'm going to get you market average returns. And I know some of you out there are getting market returns all on your own. More power to you. but the simple data shows that many people are not getting market returns. Some of you might be familiar with the Dalbar study, D-A-L-B-A-R, Dalbar study. I can throw a link in the show notes, which, for example, showed that from 2001 to 2020, again, a 20-year period, 2001 to 2020, the average retail investor received a 2.9% investment return, whereas a simple 60-40 portfolio performed at 6.4% per year over that time frame. 6.4% per year versus 2.9% per year. Some of you might be sitting here saying, like, how could the average investor underperform so much? And the answer is behavior, right? The average investor got worried and changed their asset allocation. Then they got excited and they changed their asset allocation back. They were chasing performance. They heard someone mention a stock and they bought it. They let interest rates dictate their investment choices. They lived through the great financial crisis. That period was also the dot-com bubble. 2020 is when COVID occurred. The bull run that occurred starting in the pits of 2009 and extended through 2020, maybe they got out of the market during the great financial crisis because it scared them, and then they didn't get back in until 2012, missing out on years of the bull market. Those kind of things matter. Maybe they let my Uncle Jim Cramer dictate their investment choices. I don't know. He's not really my uncle. He's more of an alien. But I was speaking to a wonderful podcast listener last month. She works in higher education at a college, and she felt the impacts of COVID probably more acutely than most people did back in the spring of 2020 due to her role at this college, at this university. And understandably so, during that time period, she thought to herself, man, this is going to change society forever. And I don't blame her for thinking that. So she went to cash, and then she missed out on 40% returns before she decided to buy back in. And I just went back and looked, right? The S&P 500 has grown at 10.5% per year over the last 20 years, assuming all dividends were reinvested. But if you put her 40% mistake from 2020 into that compound growth, her 20-year compounded return is 7.7% per year. Again, the market returned 10.5%, and at best, she got 7.7% per year. Now, I know many of you might never make that mistake, and good for you, but I got a lot of nervous phone calls and emails back in April 2025 during the tariff tantrum. That was a 12% peak to trough drop, and then a 5-week recovery after Liberation Day. What was it? Independence Day? Revolution Day? And if you'd rather start the clock back in February of 2025 at the local market high, it was a 19% drop, peak to trough, 19% drop, and then a 4-month period until we were back to all-time highs. Now, that type of drop, 12% over 5 weeks, happens literally every year. Literally, 10% drops in the market happen more than once per year on average. It's more frequent than Christmas. So if you're immune to that, amazing. I hope most of us are. That's a great place to be in your investing if you can just ignore the 10, the 15% drops. Maybe my work has helped you get there. Fantastic. But if you're not immune to those drops, that's okay. A lot of people aren't immune to those drops. And I would contend that you have someone that you know, someone in your family, some friends, some colleagues who aren't immune to those kind of drops. And if those people are getting 3% per year instead of 6% per year, like the Dalbar study shows, if those people are bailing in COVID, turning a 10.5% return over 20 years into a 7.7% return over 20 years, then yeah, I think that person would likely get hundreds of thousands of dollars in value out of working with some helpful, honest financial planner. And that's only the investing part, right? That's only the portfolio. All I've talked about so far is the behavior of good, simple investing. We haven't even gotten to the fun stuff like tax-efficient drawdown strategies in retirement and when to take Social Security and how to ensure you aren't whacked by IRMA, even if it is only 1% per year. Proper estate planning, how to think about how to leave assets to your heirs, how to think about the best take advantage of capital gains and capital losses. Now, personally, those are the things that I think about and that I work on every day. And for a lot of those items that I just listed, I know that we can only increase someone's after-tax investment returns by maybe a 0.1% here, 0.25% there, 1/3, 0.5% over here. But if you cobble all those things together, all of a sudden, you're talking about thousands of dollars per year, every single year, compounded for the rest of someone's life. And the funny thing is, you totally could spend some time to learn all this stuff on your own. I mean, seriously, right? 10 years ago, I pretty much knew none of this stuff I'm talking about now, literally like close to zero of it. I just decided to dedicate a lot of my waking life to it, ended up changing careers, right? Wrote a few hundred articles, produced over 100 podcast episodes about it. I've done, I think, a decent job of building up this pretty foundational knowledge base. If instead I devoted all that time to car maintenance, I would never hire a mechanic again, right? If instead I devoted all that time to health and wellness, maybe I would have opened up my own gym or my own, nutrition guidance business. But I ended up choosing, because I enjoyed it, devoting all that time to smart financial planning. And I see the value that I can provide. I can measure that value in dollars and cents. So yes, index funds exist. For some of you, you hear my episodes and you say, yep, Jesse, I know that stuff. I get what you're saying. I'm going to implement all of it in my own life because I just love it, Jesse, kind of like you love it, Jesse. And so sorry, I'm a DIYer through and through, and that's amazing. Seriously, kudos to you. But for the others and the people you know, I just want to say, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, I know what I'm doing. I understand what Jesse has to say, but I also understand my own limitations. I want to reclaim my time. I want to set something up for my spouse in case something happens to me. I also know I could be squeezing more out of these lemons. They have tools I don't have. They have expertise I don't have. This stresses me out and I don't want it to. Index funds are beautiful, a foundation, I think, of just about any good portfolio. But what real financial planners have to do is a lot more than that, and sometimes a lot more important than just index funds. And so anyway, on that note, another common question that I get, and a totally reasonable question, is someone will write in and say, Jesse, can I pay you like $200 for an hour of your time? I just want you to spot check, just give me a spot check of my DIY financial plan. And unfortunately, the answer to that question is no, but it's important I explain why. So far this year, I think probably 30, maybe 35 of you have reached out to wanting to hire me for an hour here, a little retirement check there, 1 or 2 hours. And again, the answer has been no, I don't offer hourly planning services. And the important question is why? Why not? And so first, I think of this little metaphor between Wegmans and Costco. Costco, you've probably heard of. Wegmans, if you don't know, is a very popular, probably the most popular grocery chain in New York, let alone kind of in the Northeast, the mid-Atlantic coast. And so the question I have is, why doesn't Costco have this beautiful curated cheese and olive bar like Wegmans does? Like Wegmans has this beautiful, it's just so many fancy cheeses, fancy olives, all this fancy charcuterie. But then again, why doesn't Wegmans sell diapers in packs of 222, yes, that's the real number, packs of 222 diapers like Costco does? I think the answer is pretty simple. Wegmans and Costco, they have different business models, different ideal customers. Those customers have different wants, different needs, different expectations. Both businesses can clearly thrive in the same marketplace. They're similar in a lot of ways, but they're different enough that they appeal to different customers and they can both thrive. And the same applies to the world of financial planning. Some people do not want an hourly financial planning service, nor a one-time planning service. Some people want an ongoing relationship with a financial planner for the rest of their life, and they expect to pay an annual fee for that. Some people want Wegmans, some people want Costco. Some people want hourly services, some people want full-time. I know that statement is polarizing, especially in the DIY personal finance movement, and I know that's a lot of you listening, because I get it. I see the numbers, I see the emails I get, and many, maybe even most DIYers, they don't want an ongoing relationship. They want a static one-time service to spot check their DIY results. And again, it's the fitness buff. If you're a fitness buff, you'd probably never hire a personal trainer. If you're a fantastic cook, you're not going to go out to dinner or order dinner as much. You're going to cook on your own. If you're really handy, you'll remodel your bathroom instead of hiring a contractor. My brother's a contractor, right? He redoes his own bathroom. He redid his own garage. He redid his own basement. I'm not as handy as he is. And I hired him to do my basement. Anyway, that's the way of the world. If we've developed strong DIY skills, we're less likely to hire a professional to help us. If you love digging into every nook and cranny of your financial life and you're accepting of the consequences, both good and bad, then you should 100% continue down the DIY path. If that sounds like you, I totally get it. That is how I felt as a DIYer before changing careers. But, and trust me when I say this, we have self-selected, you all have self-selected to listen to a nerdy podcast about the nitty-gritty details of financial planning. We are this little tribe of financial planning nerds. And trust me when I say this, a lot of people, maybe even most people out there, they're not like us, okay? They're not like us. They do not want to be a nerdy retirement planning DIYer who spends an hour every other week listening to Jesse Kramer talk about nerdy retirement planning topics. Instead, most people, they want to outsource it to some sort of trusted expert full-time. They don't want to fly the plane. They want to hop in the back of the plane, hands off the tiller, and they want to let a professional pilot fly them to their destination. So going back to me and my business, right? I don't need to be a 7-Eleven convenience store that caters to people who just need a quick item. My business model, and more on that in a minute, works well without hourly engagements. But I want to get into this broader reason why there are few good financial planners offering hourly or one-time services. And the main reason why is, well, one of two main reasons why, which I'll get into, is it's a regulatory and compliance hassle. And so for better or worse, running a firm that offers ongoing services is significantly easier than running a firm that offers hourly services. So to be an independent financial planner like me, you have to form an organization called a Registered Investment Advisor, or RIA. So I'll use that term a little bit right today. RIA, Registered Investment Advisor. So an RIA is a firm, not a person, that is registered with either the Securities and Exchange Commission, so that's the SEC, right, on the federal level. And that's the case if the firm manages over $100 million for its clients. Or an RIA can be registered with individual state regulators if the firm manages less than $100 million for its clients. So RIAs, they can kind of run the gamut. They can provide investment advice to their clients, so that's individuals, families, or businesses. RIAs are fiduciaries by law. They are legally obligated to always act in their client's best interests. So again, they have to register with the SEC or at the state level, disclose their fees, file regulatory documents, adhere to compliance rules. There's some overhead, there's some headache really to forming an RIA. But let's consider those regulations, those rules, those registration rules through the lens of hourly planning, right? 99% of hourly planning clients, maybe some folks like you, they only want advice. They only want planning. That's the advice-only business model. They don't want investment management. They're going to maintain and manage their portfolio on their own. Therefore, for the RIA, that $100 million federal threshold is never going to be reached. Hourly planners instead need to register at the state level. And to make matters worse, really, for the planner, they have to register in every state in which they have 5 or more clients. So personally, based on relationships that I've formed either on my own or through the podcast, I would have to register in New York, California, Texas and Florida, Washington, North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, and Illinois. Like, that's a lot of regulatory hassle that I would have to manage independently as a solo hourly planner. I can't charge clients for that time, right? It's just a sunk cost that I have to deal with. Instead, though, I'm an employee at an RIA here in Rochester, New York. We're well above the $100 million threshold. We're actually above $3 billion under management. We work with about 1,000 families. And yes, we have to register with the SEC. I have a specific colleague, a coworker, one person who handles that compliance work for the entire firm. The rest of us, we get to focus on working with clients. Personally, in my own day-to-day work, I have zero regulatory hassle. But then there's the juice, right? Is the juice worth the squeeze? So to be an hourly planner, I think we should ask ourselves that, or any hourly planner, any business person should ask themselves that. Is the juice worth the squeeze? And let's be honest, we're here in a capitalist system. Capitalism doesn't have to be evil. It just means that we work in a system where the payoff needs to be worth the effort that we put into something. So let's discuss fees and revenue of this business. Now, the SEC doesn't mandate how hourly fees work, but many states do impose a maximum on hourly fees that planners can charge, and it's usually $250 an hour. Now, the reader, Ken, who kind of inspired this article that I'm now reading out loud to you, he wanted to offer me $150 to $200 an hour for my time. And it's totally fair to ponder, well, Jesse, if you were charging $200 an hour and you multiply that by the average of 2,000 working hours a year, that's $400,000 of revenue. And that's an amazing amount, even after some costs of running a business. If I could open my own hourly practice at $400,000 of revenue, I would be living large. But that assumption has some really significant problems. In short, no hourly planner comes even close to 2,000 billable hours in a year. Most don't even reach 1,000 billable hours in a year. Before I can offer any client just the first morsel of advice, I would need to do, on average, probably about 4 hours of work. I have to meet with the client, discuss working together or not, like, are we even a good fit? I'd have to learn all of your financial facts and circumstances, your goals, your timelines, the things we talk about here. I'd set you up in record-keeping software. I'd perform the necessary compliance activities to add you as a client, contracts, all that kind of thing. Set you up in our financial planning software and upload all your relevant information there. So that's probably like $800 to $1,000 of my time before I can give you the very first answer. And most DIYers do not like that. They won't bite. So as such, hourly planners need to make a concession. Either charge less or start giving away time for free, right? Those first 4 hours of setup, not going to charge you for it. I'm only going to charge you for it when I actually start my work. And the list goes on. There are just, unfortunately, a lot of unbillable tasks. Compliance and registration and archiving and audits, business operations like accounting and bookkeeping or taxes, integrating a tech stack, like what technology will the firm use, choosing and maintaining planning software, scheduling meetings, client onboardings, doing that all under umbrella of perfect cybersecurity, or just marketing and business development. So, in my case, my blog, my podcast play a really big role in my business, but they take a lot of time. And no client pays me, and it's not fair for any client to pay me for the hours that I put into these projects. And as Mike Piper, who's like a well-known and well-respected voice in the financial planning space, he wrote on this topic in a very similar way. He said, and this is kind of a long quote, "Relatedly, many people assume that an hourly financial professional's weekly compensation is probably somewhere along the lines of 40 times their hourly rate. But that's not remotely the case. A 2023 survey found that an hourly billable rate of $204 an hour, which was the average for CPAs, again, accountants, with 8 to 10 years of experience, equated to an average annual compensation of $105,000 a year, or $2,000 a week, about 10 times their hourly billable rate. And I strongly suspect that it's typically lower than 10 times their hourly rate for registered investment advisors, given that RIAs are regulated more heavily than CPAs. They have to spend more time on compliance activities that are not billable. So again, that might sound crazy. It even sounds a little crazy to me. But what Mike Piper is saying there is that the average accountant bills at $200 an hour for 10 billable hours a week, and that he believes the hours for financial planners are even lower. So that's charging $200 an hour to make $100,000 a year or less. And ask any attorney, ask any accountant for their feelings about hourly billing. It's a notorious pain in the butt. It's a significant hurdle. So what to do instead? That's why most RIAs opt for an assets under management, an AUM percentage billing model. These are businesses. This billing model results in more consistent revenue for less regulatory hassle, with lots of individuals and families knocking at the door to sign up. Now, as a business owner, I think it makes sense. It's probably common sense to go down this route. In many cases, including mine, AUM firms are still fee-only and fiduciary. This is important, right? The AUM fee is the only way we collect revenue. That's fee-only. Now, what is interesting and totally worth pointing out, the same states that cap hourly rates at $250 an hour also often cap AUM rates at 2.0%. Now, a 2.0 annual fee is a ton. It's a lot. And it ought to come with like every single service and piece of advice and expertise under the sun. And I'd venture that any firms out there, like 99% of the firms out there that are charging 2.0% per year, they're probably committing highway robbery. And the same cannot be said for an hourly planner who's charging $250 an hour. Those two maximum fees are vastly different, but the state regulators don't seem to see that. Thankfully, though, the Kitces, Michael Kitces, his research team, found that most RIA firms have significantly lower AUM fees than 2.0%, especially as a client's wealth increases. So simply put, as asset sizes grow, the required work, the required expertise typically don't scale. Thus, someone's fee absolutely should decay as asset levels increase. Now, 1.001% is kind of the industry standard. I can speak here, the average fee at my firm, the average dollar here falls in the 0.65% range. So about 65 hundredths of a percent. Again, I'm a little biased, I get it, but that style of AUM fee, especially when you compare it to the services that someone receives, isn't excessive. One lens to examine that truism is through profits. If a company is raking in huge profit margins, that might be a sign that it's charging too much. Fiduciary RIA firms typically have a 20 to 25, maybe 30% profit margins. Legal and accounting firms, law and accounting firms have similar margins. Healthcare, construction, auto garages typically have a 15 to 20% margin. Grocery stores, which we mentioned before, famously have near zero margins, like a 1 to 3% margin. However, since AUM firms' revenues are based on portfolio performance, those margins can dry up during bear markets. During, for example, the great financial markets, some of my colleagues, those in leadership and ownership, literally went years without taking a paycheck. It was a means to ensure that other employees could keep their jobs. But that 20% margin, that assets under management fee that led to a 20% margin, when the market drops by 50%, like it did during the great financial crisis, not only do you no longer make profit, you might be operating at a loss. So there's a risk involved. There's also a bit of an incentives problem that I think is important to consider. Friend of the blog, Charlie Munger, famously said, "Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes." And I feel when I show up to work every morning, these 4 strong incentives that are working in favor of an annual AUM fee model that align my work with my clients' goals. The first one is that client success equals business success. You might have heard that tagline, if you do better, we do better. Well, it creates a long-term win-win alignment. The second one, there's a focus on retention, right? Because I don't charge a one and done fee, because I charge an annual fee, I'm incentivized to build trust, to offer great service, and to think long-term on behalf of my clients. The third big one is that our fee structure discourages unnecessary trading. Unlike commission-based models, AUM fees don't reward transactions, right? There's no incentive to churn. There's no incentive to sell or to push products. The only incentive is to give honest and good advice so that you want to continue being our clients. And then the fourth one is that this fee model encourages holistic planning. Since the fee isn't tied to hours or tasks, my team is free to go deeper, to do ongoing work, estate planning, tax planning, retirement optimization, behavioral coaching, without needing to bill for time. And of course, the AUM model is not perfect, but I do believe it strongly aligns clients with their financial planner, with their professional. And I can point to many instances of client success in just, 3.5, 4 short years since my transition from engineering. So those are all the reasons I don't offer hourly advice. There are many good advisors out there who do offer hourly advice. It's just worth understanding the difference. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. I send a free weekly email to thousands of readers that shares 2 simple things, just 2. The first are my new articles and podcasts, so you'll never miss when I publish new content. And the second is my favorite financial content from other corners of the internet, so you can see what's been helping me the most.
But Jesse, I don't want another email.
I hear you. I make this newsletter short, sweet, and full of essential information, and readers enjoy that. About 85% of newsletter subscribers are engaging with the newsletter more than once a month. They're enjoying it, and you will too. You can subscribe for free on the homepage at bestinterest.blog, and you'll get a free PDF of my white paper titled The Step-by-Step Guide to Building Your Retirement Paycheck. That's right, a free weekly email that thousands of people like you are already reading, a free white paper to help you plan for retirement, and you can sign up for free at bestinterest.blog. Okay, this next topic is one that, maybe it's not the most complex topic, but I see it coming up time and time again in families that otherwise have, some reasonably complex financial plans. And yet the simple topic really it's a hiccup. It's a tripping point. It's something that so many families seem to run into. And it's the fact that you cannot outgrow or you cannot outcompound what I would consider a bad spending plan, or maybe we don't call it bad, maybe we just call it overspending. And it's one of those things where, I don't spend a lot of time talking about budgeting. I don't spend a lot of time talking about spending because it's kind of this personal finance 101 thing that the Dave Ramseys of the world spend a lot of time talking about. But it is foundational. It's this foundational thing. And we can't get to the point where we're talking about, intricate retirement tax withdrawal strategies unless you have some intricate retirement accounts and some assets put away. And you can't get to that point where you have assets put away. You can't outcompound the fact that you're not saving any money in the first place. And now for reference, and the reason why I kind of had this thought in the first place is here in upstate New York, I'll see these families, married couples, and then they've got some children maybe, and they're earning like 90th, 95th, 99th percentile salaries in the USA. That's like $300,000, $500,000, $700,000 a year or more. And some of these families are saving 6 figures of income per year, and that's amazing. But other of these families are basically living paycheck to paycheck, or sometimes even worse. And on one hand, you might be thinking like, whoa, that's crazy, sounds wrong, that's exaggerated, it's baloney. There's no way it's possible. How often do you have to eat out at restaurants to outspend a $700,000 salary? And the short answer is, well, it's usually not dining out that's really the problem. It could be stuff like nannies, housekeepers, personal chefs, landscapers, personal assistants, people outsourcing these time-consuming tasks. Private schooling and tutoring is a huge one. Private coaching for kids in sports, music and dance lessons, exclusive summer camps, college planning, test prep. That's another really big one. Kids are expensive, especially if you choose to let them do really fun, fancy, expensive things. Yeah, sure, there's the second home at the lake or the beach or the mountains that, some people have that as a big line item. I think high-end airfare, travel, 5-star resorts, travel concierges, nice cars, nice boats, jewelry, art, country clubs. So a lot of times there are these $500,000 salary families living in very close proximity with other $500,000 salary families. And to them, some of those trappings that I just listed out, that's just normal life, right? They consider that normal life. It's that all the families send their kids to private school. All the families belong to one of the golf clubs. All the families have a cottage down at the lake. And it really is. It's the definition of keeping up with the Joneses. But at the end of the day, if that family can't also afford to save 15 or 20 or 25% of their income, then they are falling behind in the long-term race. And when we think about retirement planning and things like the 4% rule, the withdrawal rule, the money that you earn does not matter in and of itself. Again, I'll say that again because it's so important. The money that you earn does not matter in and of itself. It only matters in relation to the money that you spend and the money that you save. That's what really matters, right? Show me a family that's earning $200,000, but saving $100,000 per year. That's an enormous 50% growth savings rate, which I know it might not be possible for 99% of families out there. But still, if you show me that family, I'll show you one of the most financially stable families I've ever seen. But if I contrast that against a family earning $500,000 a year, but only saving 24 grand a year in one person's 401k, right? By maxing out one person's 401k, I'll show you a family who's living a great life, I'm sure, a great lifestyle, but really stressing their finances to the maximum. Maybe they know that. Maybe they know they're stressing their finances and that worries them. Or maybe they're just blissfully unaware of how far behind they're actually falling. But one thing I do know for sure, it's very, very hard for these families to remind themselves and at times to remind their children that they're living a charmed life, right? It's that David Foster Wallace thing. This is water. It's one of my favorite speeches. I know I reference it probably too often, but it's hard to see life for what it is when you're so immersed in it. It's hard to see the picture when you're inside the frame. So many people, they don't feel wealthy. They don't feel like they're in the top 10, the top 5, the top 1%. Their children don't feel like they're living one of the statistically best childhoods probably in the history of humanity. They call it hedonic adaptation. We get used to things feeling good and then it just becomes the new normal. But we must try to derive our satisfaction and our purpose from other sources in life. If our joy is tied to having a bigger house, a nicer car, playing on the better golf course, opening a nicer bottle of wine, subtly showing off a more expensive watch, sending the kids to a better summer camp, summering, I know, summer as a verb, summering in a more exclusive spot on a more remote lake, to me, that's a hollow existence. And getting back to financial planning, I mean, no amount of compounding can magically turn some 3 or 4 or 5% savings rate into enough money to retire. As an example, just for kicks and giggles, I threw this in a spreadsheet. I had someone who was saving 4% of their annual income, which is not enough, 4% of their annual income. And then I assumed their investment could compound at an astronomical 12% per year forever. So again, it's an unrealistic growth rate. But just to show you, it would still, despite that unrealistic growth rate, it would take this person 37 years of those unrealistic investment returns to retire in a healthy way. And the reason why is they're simply not saving enough. But if we contrast that against someone who's saving a very, very healthy 25% of their income, and we assume a much more conservative 8% annual rate of return, that person can retire in a very healthy way after 24 years. So that would be someone who maybe starts saving in their 20s or their early 30s, and they're retired by 50 or 55. And that doesn't assume any use of Social Security even. Now, at these large amounts of income that we're talking about in this case, and I know I'm kind of cherry picking only the upper middle class and even the upper class in terms of wealth, but it's worth thinking about some of the differences I just outlined. Because again, let's say that both those families in my hypothetical just now, they're high earners. They're the people earning $300,000, $500,000, $700,000 a year. In this case, I'll just use the round number of $500,000 a year. They're living a charmed life. And the first family saves only 4%. They only save 20 grand of that per year. They're likely paying something like $125,000 in taxes per year if you run it into a tax calculator, which means left over, they have about $30,000 a month to spend. The second family, that's saving much more. They're saving 25%. So they're saving about $125,000 a year. They're probably paying about 100 grand in taxes. And therefore, they only have 23 grand a month to spend. 30 grand versus 23 grand per month to spend. I know on paper, there's a pretty significant difference between 30 grand and 23 grand a month. But I contend that those are both big, big numbers. And in most places in the United States, you could live a wonderful life, a simply wonderful life at either of those amounts. Two different families living two different examples of a wonderful life. And it's just that one family is going to work until their mid-60s at least, and then the other family is going to retire in their early 50s if they wanted to. So I suppose a lot of this conversation comes down to how much wonderful do you want in your life? And where are you willing to sacrifice some wonderful in pursuit of better long-term results? And here's what I mean, an example that just kind of popped into my head as I was writing these things down. Me and my hometown buddies, I'm from a really rural kind of agricultural town about an hour east of Rochester. And me and some of my buddies from home, we grew up playing golf, like very kind of poor golf, on a former farm pasture that any honest golfer would give like a D+ rating to. But we liked it. We had a lot of fun. But the point is that my bar for golf is pretty low. I've got a low bar. Now, coincidentally, Rochester, New York is oddly this bit of a golf mecca. We've got just a high frequency of really highly rated courses, especially when compared to just the number of people living here and our generally lousy weather. I mean, the winters here are brutal. Fall and spring aren't exactly wonderful. Yet, for whatever reason, we do have a lot of golfers and a lot of really nice golf courses here. And I could go join like a C-level golf club here, much nicer than the golf course in my hometown, but by no means like that nice of a club, and expect to pay maybe $2,000 or $3,000 for a year for membership. And to me, that would be this wonderful, luxurious perk in life. Or to contrast that, I could go join Oak Hill. Oak Hill is regularly rated one of the top 25 golf clubs in America. It's got a one-time upfront initiation fee over $100,000. Monthly dues are probably something like $2,000 or $2,500 a month, including all the months with snow on the ground, by the way. So you're not golfing, you're still paying, $2,000 to be a member there. I've been there in the clubhouse and on the course at Oak Hill, and it's amazing. There's no other way to describe it, right? It's world-class in every way, obviously including the costs. But I want to go back to the idea that a lot of this conversation comes down to how much wonderful do you want and where are you willing to sacrifice your wonderful? Now, for me, I'm not that big of a golfer. I think it's a blast. I love to play, but I'm not that big of a golfer, and I've got a pretty low bar. So for me, I can easily look at the world and say, I don't need to pay the money that Oak Hill would cost, assuming they'd even let me in the club in the first place. And even, I'm not even sure I'd want to pay $2,500 a year to join the C-level club. I'm not sure I would get my money out of it. I might play 10 rounds of golf a year, and I'll just go pay, $30, $50, $70 at a time to go play. And that's fine with me. I'm totally willing to sacrifice a wonderful golf life in pursuit of something else, because I'll admit to you, when I think about the things that really light my fire, I've always loved spending time in the woods and on the water. And could I see myself someday spending some probably inordinate amount of money on a house in the woods or in the mountains by the water, maybe all three? I totally could. It's a long-term goal. It might take us decades to get there and a lot of good decisions along the way. And I think I'll really enjoy it. And my point is that that's a decision that I'm making, that we're making in pursuit of our wonderful life. And even though golf is fun, I don't care about it nearly enough to sink any significant money into it. I do enjoy nature, the woods, the mountains, the water enough to start saving for it today. So whether you're earning $50,000 a year, $100,000 a year, or $500,000 a year, like, we all have to make these decisions. And I just think it's so interesting that I can see, and I have seen, some families earning in the top 1%, the top 2%. They're earning enough money that you could argue they should be living a totally wonderful life, and they could be saving a lot of money as well. But it involves some hard decisions. What parts of a wonderful life are they willing to sacrifice? And unless we really feel strongly about where we're willing to sacrifice, it's easy to fall into that trap of keeping up with your neighbors and keeping up with your Joneses and keeping up with the people in the PTA. And next thing you know, you're spending every single penny of that $500,000 salary, and you're not really making any progress for the long run. And my last one today, I really like this one. And in case you didn't already know it, man, the world of internet financial advice is the wild, wild west. And I know I'm being a little bit of a hypocrite here, because I write on the internet, I podcast on the internet, I'm speaking to you right now via the internet in some way. Granted, I do have something to lose here though, right? I could lose my licenses or my clients. This is how I put food on the table. I do have some skin in the game to provide good, thoughtful advice. And also, I'm not anonymous, right? You can look me up. You can send hate mail to me at jesse@bestinterest.blog, or you could look up my boss and send him some hate mail on my behalf. So I've got a little skin in the game. But anyway, back to the point. The world of internet financial advice is scary. And the reason why I put this all down, I got an email the other day from someone who was trying to message me on Reddit. So I went to Reddit to try to find this message. And an anonymous stranger, they wrote to me and they said, "Hi, since you're a fiduciary planner, I wanted to ask you something. I run a small business where I create personal finance guides to help people just like you. I spent countless hours researching and writing them. I was wondering if you could give me your feedback on one of my guides." It's a reasonable request. They create guides. I think when they said for people just like me, I think they meant for average Joes. And they just maybe copied and pasted that for somewhere else. And then they sent me a link to one of their guides. Now, granted, I don't usually click on links from strangers, and I did not click on this link. Instead, I went back to their Reddit history, where you can look at kind of the comments and the posts they've made in the past, because I wanted to see, like, okay, what kind of financial advice is this person doling out over the recent weeks and months? And here was an example. They wrote, "When you retire, you want to have as much money as possible. And in order to do that, you need to max out your contributions each year and invest in a total market or S&P 500 fund, specifically in a Roth IRA, because that way you actually get to keep more of the money." Okay, where did they go wrong? First off, they started with, when you retire, you want to have as much money as possible. I mean, sure, some people might want that, but most people simply want enough to retire. And as much money as possible isn't exactly an attainable goal. There's always more. Maybe it's semantics, but already I'm a little bit turned off by this advice. And then they said, you need to max out your contributions each year. Now, in general, that is good advice. I won't argue with that. I think if you have the capability of maxing out contributions to your tax advantage qualified accounts, yeah, totally, I get that. And then they say, and invest in a total market or S&P 500 fund. Now, this is the classic case of generally reasonable advice, but specifically kind of crazy advice, right? It's generally reasonable to suggest that someone diversify via low-cost index funds, broad-based stocks, and I assume that's what this person meant. But without knowing more about the individual who's actually asking the question, right? Without knowing more about the individual who's seeking the advice, it's specifically crazy to suggest that they go all in on stocks and all in on US stocks. It's something we've talked about here before. It's not appropriate to say, I don't know anything about you, but you got to save a bunch of money and throw it all into the stock market. And then last, this person says, specifically, you want to save in a Roth IRA because that way you actually get to keep more of the money. So this is when I knew I was dealing with someone who just didn't really know at the end of the day what they were talking about. There's nothing about a Roth IRA on its own that does or does not allow an investor to keep more of their money than, say, compared with a traditional IRA or a taxable brokerage account. Right? We have to understand the investor's current and future tax rates to say something like a Roth IRA provides you the best after-tax value. And so anyway, that's just one piece of advice from this one person on the internet. And when I read their advice, I kind of realized, I saw that this person was stuck inside a particular personal finance echo chamber. And listeners, part of my goal is I don't really want you to get stuck in that echo chamber too. The online, the DIY, the FIRE echo chambers, they tend to say things, not always, but it is a tendency. They tend to say things like, take your Social Security as early as possible, or take your Social Security at 70. Very rarely do I hear someone actually detailing all the considerations for when to take Social Security. Like, it is a nuanced conversation. It involves a few different moving pieces, and yet I feel like 95% of the advice I see out there is either take it at 62 or take it at 70. Another very common piece of advice, go all stocks, or at least have a much, much higher allocation to stocks than I think I or any reasonable financial planner would recommend. And why do we see this advice so much? It's because people, DIYers, investors in general, are a little bit blinded by recency bias of the past 15 years. Because over the past 15 years, index funds and chill, all stocks and chill, VOO and chill, and having that continue to provide a 12% return every single year forever without much volatility until the end of time. I mean, that's the way the last 15 years have been, but we need to zoom out a little bit further and realize that we've had a pretty blessed run for these last 15 or 16 years. It's really since March 2009 is kind of the beginning point. And it's highly unlikely things will last like this forever. So the idea of being all in on stocks is a little bit too zoomed in. It's a little bit myopic. And on that note, kind of a sister piece of advice is the S&P 500 is all you need. America is all you need. You don't need international stocks. These big US companies are international in some ways anyway, right? They're multinational corporations. All I can say about that one is, like all trends in the market, the more people who actually believe that specific piece of advice to be true, the less likely it'll actually play out in the long run. I think we're much better off just remaining humble, admitting that we probably don't have the ability to make decades-long macroeconomic predictions, and avoiding the home country bias if we can. The next piece of advice that we see online a lot: Roth is king. Roth. I mean, listen, I'm a huge fan of Roth accounts. Of course I am. I'm super glad they exist. My wife and I both have one. Many of my clients who can have one do have one. And in many ways, your Roth dollars are the most precious dollars in your entire financial plan. Some people would say, I suppose, that HSA dollars are better, but any way you cut the cake, Roth accounts are a wonderful thing. But just because they are the most precious dollars in a lot of our financial plans, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the smartest thing for you to maximize your Roth every year. It doesn't mean that it's the smartest thing for you to do Roth conversions just to put more money in your Roth account, because you have to sacrifice something in order to put dollars into that Roth account. You have to pay taxes. So some people will forego tax deductions in their highest tax brackets in pursuit of maxing out their Roth 401k. And 99% of the time, that's a dumb thing to do. But because of this Roth kind of undercurrent, people do it anyway. Another one that I see a lot is when someone says, well, you only need, X dollars to be financially free. Or even something as simple as the 4% rule. They'll say, oh, just multiply by 25 the 4% rule and you can retire. But even the 4% rule is full of nuance. And just as an example, let me ask you some questions and we'll see how many of these questions you feel really confident answering. What portfolio allocation among stocks and bonds is assumed in the study underlying the 4% rule? What was the portfolio allocation that created the 4% rule? What timeline or how many years of retirement was assumed in the study that created the 4% rule? Does the 4% rule assume that you're taking Social Security? Does it assume that your spouse is taking Social Security? How does the 4% rule account for the different taxation between traditional dollars and Roth dollars and taxable dollars? Now, some of you listening probably know every single answer to those questions. I would wager that, though, that many of you might not know all of those answers, and that's totally okay, right? We don't need to know everything, except to know, we should know that even the blanket rules of thumb in financial planning still require a lot of specific thought when applied to our unique financial plan. So again, when someone says, oh, in today's day and age, you just need $1.5 million to retire. You just need $800,000 to retire. It's hogwash. I hate those things because even these blanket rules of thumb require so much specific thought to apply them to our unique financial plan. And the last one today, one of my personal favorites, a little pet peeve or a pet project that I like to beat this drum, is just when people say the market always goes up. And again, it just requires a little bit of nuance, right? The 1970s were a lost decade for the stock market. The 2000s were a lost decade for the stock market. Zero return. The market does not always go up. I suppose if we zoom out far enough, yes, it always has gone up before. There's no guarantee necessarily that it'll always go up in the future. And this is one, I think I mentioned this on a podcast maybe in the last 10 episodes where I said some people will drop lines like, well, if it doesn't go up in the future, then we're all screwed. Not necessarily. There's a chance. I mean, I don't think this is a high probability outcome. I just think it's possible, right? It's in the range of possible outcomes. And therefore, I think this is worth addressing, where there's just some sort of general stagnation. And maybe stocks don't really go up that much. They also don't really go down that much because we say, oh, we're kind of like at full valuation to some extent. Companies aren't growing as much as we thought they would. And it's not that the economy is collapsing. It's not that the world is collapsing. It's just that the companies and their earnings in the stock market aren't necessarily growing at rates of 6 and 8 and 10% per year anymore. Like, why is that not a possibility? I think it is. It's within the range of outcomes. Again, that's all I'm saying. It's not high probability, but it is possible. And I think it's worth asking for all of us, like, how will my retirement plan fare if there is a lost decade in the stock market during my retirement? Now, not only the numbers themselves, of course, it's worth understanding the numbers themselves, but how will your brain fare if your portfolio stays negative for a few years, or if it stays stagnant for a decade? If your portfolio doesn't grow for 10 years, if you're withdrawing money to survive, to live your retirement, and also the market is dropping around you too, it's worth asking those questions. Because yes, I know the market has always gone up before, and none of us really want there to be a situation where the market stays stagnant for a few years, 5 years, 10 years or more. But it's within the range of outcomes, and it's important from a DIY retirement plan, from a financial independence retirement plan. It's important to understand what you would do, how your plan would fare if that were to happen again. Thank you, as always, for listening to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. And if you have any feedback, good or bad, for this episode, if you want to contend with something I said, by all means, drop me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog. And as always, if you have any questions for my Ask Me Anything episodes, because I know those ones are popular, you can send your individual questions to jesse@bestinterest.blog.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email over at his blog, The Best Interest. His email address is jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves. And we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice, and it's not prescriptive of your financial situation.